Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Global Education in a Post-Pandemic World. My name is Lawrence Allen, and I'm the founder of Singapore Academy USA. This webinar is for buyers of K-12 educational curriculum and live instruction. This includes institutional buyers, 501c3s, and homeschool parents. You'll walk away from this webinar with much more knowledge about what is available out there in a post-COVID world. And we're going to journey around the globe looking at the best of what's now available and how to get it for your students. We'll begin by examining where we are now in the United States with K-12 education. We'll take a quick look at Singapore Academy USA so you know who we are. We'll then examine the opportunities before us in this new world. We'll also look at how other countries do K-12 education and how to access educational resources globally. And we'll conclude with what K-12 education in America could look like in 10 years. So where are we now in the world in terms of our ranking in the key areas of reading, math, and science? Every 3 years, an organization called Program for International Student Assessment tests 15-year-olds across the world. The last exam was done in 2018 across 78 nations. Singapore ranked #1 in reading, #1 in math, and #1 in science. The #2 through 5 rankings is a mix of different countries, micro-communities such as Macau, but also European countries such as Estonia and Finland, Japan, which is a very large country, over 100 million in population, and even a North American entrant, Canada, who ranked 5th in reading. Unfortunately, the United States ranked 12th in reading, 36th in math, and 17th in science. So one must ask, what can we do about this? Is there anything that can be done? Well, I direct your attention back to 1960, the beginning of the space race with the Soviet Union. At that time, Americans were more likely to blow up rockets on a launch pad than to launch them into space. And we were well behind in the space race. But our nation came together with a common goal: to take human beings to the moon and return them safely before the end of the 1960s. And in 10 years, we were not only the first to land human beings on the moon, we have been the only country ever to have landed people on the moon. So there's no question in my mind that we can do it. So a little bit about Singapore Academy USA. We bring the world's best science, technology, engineering, and math STEM courses to American students. Our mission is to restore excellence to American education by raising the K-12 bar. We're an academically focused curriculum and live instruction provider. We're supplemental. We teach our classes on weekends and in after-school enrichment courses. We're local to Texas. We're headquartered in Plano, and we have our teaching staff in Singapore. And we're free to at-risk and underserved students. So what are the opportunities before us? Well, a recent pandemic has created the opportunities that we couldn't have imagined before, such as disruptive innovation that is changing the way education is sourced and delivered around the world today. At one time, U.S. public schools were attended by 90% of American K-12 students. Today, that number is down to 76% and declining. The Dallas Morning News said that 250,000 students were missing in Texas. Well, they weren't missing. They were missing from public schools because they went to private schools or to home schools. And one of the reasons is geographic barriers have been removed. We are no longer prisoners of our zip codes. We can go anywhere in the world, organizations, students, families, and shop for curriculum and live instruction. We can pick our own methodologies and innovations that we would like to expose our children to, deliver them the highest performance and variety of curriculum, We can shop for specific attributes and philosophical approaches to education, and even the best teachers if we are interested in acquiring live instruction through remote technologies. So how do other countries do K through 12 education? Let's first look at Finland. Finland is a Nordic country. It's a developed economy, but it is a micro community of 5.5 million people, albeit in a large country, relatively large country. Just to give you that perspective, that's about a combination of the population of Manhattan and maybe one or two boroughs of New York City. Their 2018 PISA score was 15th in math, 5th in science, and 6th in reading. And I believe in the prior assessment in 2015, they were in the top 5 in math. And I don't think it's because they've been slacking off. I just think other countries have accelerated faster than they have. Their literacy rate is 100%, and that is a credible figure. And I'll explain that in a moment. Their spending per pupil in US dollar equivalent is just over $10,000 per pupil as of 2016, which is the latest information available. And the history of Finnish education really has a long and storied past. Finland is a Lutheran country. They have a state religion, Lutheranism, and their Bible was translated into Finnish in 1548. And the practice of worship in the Lutheran faith is reading the Bible. And so starting in the late 1500s, early 1600s, the literacy rate in Finland soared. And literally by the middle of the 16th century, they had literacy rates close to 80%, which is unheard of for the time. And is not commonly seen around the world until well into the 20th century at those rates. So they were really focused on reading and education for hundreds, literally hundreds of years. One of the pillars of the Finnish educational system, one of their philosophies and core to their methodologies, is a focus on early education. Their preschool lasts until age 7. In that preschool, there's tremendous focus on the child's individual capabilities to help enable their development, to make up and develop areas where they're deficient, and to cultivate and nurture their unique characteristics. Then they enter a 9-year period of uniform basic education by age group. This is pretty standard fare where the government has national guidelines, and in the case of Finland, a relatively large degree of autonomy, which we'll talk about in a second. The final 3 years of high school is a bit different than what we do here. Students must choose an academic track or a vocational track. The objective here is that when you graduate from high school, you will be prepared to go into the academic world or into the world of work if you take the vocational track. But either way, you're going to graduate from a Finnish high school able to do what you take your next step in life. I mentioned earlier about the autonomy. It is a unique characteristic of many countries, but in particular for Finland, that the teachers who are very well educated and very well trained are fairly autonomous in how they teach their lessons, as long as they comply with the national guidelines. And having a good cadre of well-trained and highly educated teachers certainly helps with that mission. Finally, and this is unique to the Finnish culture, is the Finnish baby box. When a child is born in Finland, they go home with a government baby box. And in that baby box is instructions on how to properly breastfeed a child and take care of the child. There's diapers. There's a whole bunch of things in there to help you get started with your new child, and 3 books. 1 book for the mother, 1 on motherhood, 1 book for the father on fatherhood, and 1 book for the child. The parents will read to the child, but also when the child's old enough, read back to the parents. So this focus on education really begins at birth in Finland, and it shows in their ranking in the PISA tests. Now, halfway around the world, in a very different culture, a culture that is born of the Chinese cultural DNA, is Taiwan. They're a lot larger than Finland. They're 24 million people. They're a self-determining island and a developed economy. Their score in the PISA test is 5th in math, 9th in science, and 16th in reading. Their literacy rate is also nearly 100%. Their spending per pupil is unavailable. We have tried very hard, and I know quite a few people in Taiwan, I lived there for 5 years, who just were not able to find this data. That has not been rolled up and published. It just doesn't exist. If anyone can find it, please let me know. The history of Taiwan with regard to education really is the Chinese cultural story. You could go back 1,000 years in China, and I don't mean that euphemistically. You could literally go back 1,000 years in China. In every small hamlet and every small village, there was a civil examination center. And in that civil examination center, anyone from any walk of life could sit for civil exams, from the peasant farmer to the merchant's son. And depending on how well you did on that exam, if you did really well, you would get posts in the provincial bureaucracy. And there have even been cases where peasants would start out from the farm fields and end up being provincial level governors. So testing and examination were a social elevator for people in China, their meritocracy channel, if you will. And so if you've wondered why in Asian countries that are within the Chinese sphere place a very high priority on high test scores and studying and rote learning, that's the source of that. The other thing affecting Taiwan that has given them a great education system is that they're diplomatically isolated. They used to be recognized as the legitimate government of China, the Republic of China on Taiwan, until 1979, when the United States shifted its recognition from the Republic of China on Taiwan to the People's Republic of China in Beijing. At that time, the people of Taiwan living in a underdeveloped country or developing country really developed a bootstrap mentality. You know, there's no one who's going to come and help us. We have to do this on their own. And they launched 10 national projects, and education was a big part of achieving that national goal. And really within 20 years, they became the first and only Chinese democracy to have ever existed. They are a modern developed economy, tech-based in their orientation. And so they've been very successful, but that couldn't have been done without a robust education system, which they invested in quite heavily. So some of the pillars of the Taiwan education system is, again, the Chinese traditional rote learning and repetitive repetition, which is the core mechanics of the Chinese system, kind of use your memory, not your creativity mentality, which remains to a large degree, but they've been very aspirational, realizing the limitations of that, not producing well-rounded students, for example, but also to be competitive, not only in IQ, intelligence quotient, EQ, but also AQ, their adaptability quotient. We'll talk about that a little more in a minute. Their education system is top-down from the central government. There's little freedom for innovation or flexibility at the teacher-student level. It is a highly prescribed system, so to speak. Students are educated to the same standard. There's not a lot of flexibility for students with learning differences in the mild sense. There is a special education and a very good special education program within Taiwan for children with severe learning disabilities. But if you're a little bit out of the center, you need to get back to the center in order to properly function through their system. And that's changing as well. Parents are incredibly engaged with their students' academic careers. They hover and make sure that those kids are doing their homework and studying and taking exams, and they sign them up for extra classes, after school classes, and to fortify the K through 12 education. And weekends and after school. So it's quite a system in Taiwan that is really very vigorous and very, very challenging, but they've had great success, and their score numbers show it. Back to the European theater and the UK. There are 68 million people in the UK, which is significantly larger than Taiwan. It's a developed economy as well, of course. And their PISA scores are pretty good for a Western developed country. 17th in math, 13th in science, and 13th in reading. Their literacy rate, I'm putting 99% with an asterisk. This is the only source I could find on the British literacy rate. The numbers were there, just for some reason didn't roll up the UK in a lot of these national figures, global figures. Their spending per pupil is about $11,600 a year, was in 2016. That's likely gone up, but we're using 16 as an average measure. The history of the UK public education system is actually quite interesting and surprising to me as I was researching it for this webinar. Until 1870, all schools were private or charitable. There was no public schools, and those began to arise and grew into the early 20th century, but they were local. Each local village or township or county would develop their own schools, and then eventually the national government came in with a national education program whereby now 93% of all UK students are in what they call maintained schools, which is equivalent to our public schools. The pillars of the UK education, well, they have a nationalized curriculum, but local decision-making on content. The UK teacher I spoke with described it this way. She said, we'll be given guidance that we need to teach, for example, wars of the 20th century. We'll be given a list of curriculum resources, but whether we spend 50% of our time on the First World War and 50% on all the other wars, or we evenly spread it, that's up to us and how we do it and what mix of academic resources we choose. So there's quite a bit of autonomy and localized decision-making. But one of the more interesting features of the UK system is they have a luxury of options. You know, here in the US, again, we have three buckets. We have public school, private school, or homeschool. That's it, right? In the UK, they have almost 10 different varieties. They have fee-paying schools, which are described into three different types: public, private, and independent. And I'm going to not spend time here trying to explain all that because it is quite complex and hard to understand. Maintained schools, yes, again, like our US public schools, but there's four variants of that. They have free schools and academies, two different kinds. And homeschool has been growing dramatically. So if you're in the UK, you have quite a few choices in the types of schools you could have your children go to. And each of those schools may have a different approach. They may be more directive and assessment oriented, taking tests and learning knowledge that way, or alternative approaches, more holistic approaches. All of that is available to the people in the UK because they've gone charter school. And I think a decade and a half now, they've been predominantly charter school. So in the past, they were what they called the catchment area approach, where you were, again, a prisoner of your zip code. You pay your taxes here, your children go to school here, end of story. And that used to be the rule. But now with charter schools, the UK has really transformed the landscape. And I think the options and variety of school options is characteristic of a charter school approach. So one of the teachers that I spoke with, again, she was very keen on this and saying, you know, there was a time when that first began and families flooded the good charter schools, the good schools, and there were waiting lists, but the poorly performing schools were empty. And so in order to exist and not go extinct, these poor performing schools had to up their performance and to draw students back. And so she said that was a tide that floated all boats, and the children and the people of the UK were much better served by a competitive education system rather than one that was state directed. The other characteristic is, this one is kind of on the negative side, inflexibility. Inflexibility in a very narrow scope, which is if you're in eighth grade at that age, you stay in eighth grade. They do not like students moving out of their age group. So what teachers tend to do is they'll find a student who's, say, in the eighth grade who really belongs in the ninth or even 10th grade, and they'll work with them individually on the side and help them do 10th grade work, but while staying in the eighth grade and the age appropriate level. And so that's the UK. Now, the USA, we're 330 million people, much larger than the UK, obviously. We are the world's leading developed economy. We are 5% of the world's population, but we generate 25% of global GDP. But you wouldn't know it looking at our 15-year-olds' test scores in math, science, and reading. Again, the good, the bad, and the ugly in this presentation. We're 36th in math, 17th in science, and 12th in reading. What's our literacy rate? You tell me. I have never seen something so politicized in my lifetime of researching. This number is all over the place. I've seen reports that say 86% of the population is literate, 54% are functionally literate, the rest are literate, some in the 90s. So I really don't know. I wouldn't even venture to put a number down because it's so highly politicized, something we just seem to do really well these days. And so I don't have a real handle on that. And I don't think anybody else does either. But if somebody knows and has a reliable source, please reach out. Let me know. I'd love to nail that one down. Our spending is clear, though. We're the most expensive school system at $13,600 per student. And that was in 2016, of course. Our history with K through 12 education is decentralized. Local communities, one-room schoolhouses in the countryside, people moved into cities. We still retain that locally funded, locally run school, but we've seen increasing federal funding, but not as much as you think. And I'll show that to you in a moment, but certainly increasing federal control. The pillars of our education system: lower the bar in order to, in the name of inclusion. If students aren't stepping up, let's lower the bar so more can succeed. And this has been a trend that's been around for, I don't know, we're certainly well over a decade, maybe longer, likely longer. But even gone to certain extremes where certain extreme communities are eliminating examinations altogether, for example, and testing. So the lower the bar in the name of inclusion has been a real negative feature of our system. And it's had obvious implications for all American students. And I think is reflective of our score on the PISA. We're college for all here. That's the core orientation. Everybody's being prepped for college, whether they go on a vocational track or not. So I'm afraid that they might be, this one size fits all might be not serving either the academic track students or the vocational students. One expert in education who consulted on this presentation, development of this presentation, described the American public school systems as a foreign and artificial environment that does not prepare children for the world to come. That's a pretty harsh assessment, but he backed it up. He said, you can look at what we're doing today, and it's virtually what we did in the mid-'80s. He described a revamp of the American education system in the '80s and said that we really haven't changed a bit since. We're doing the same thing with the same people, the same way. There's a horrendous, not invented here mentality, a lot of inbreeding with curriculum suppliers and curriculum buyers and different schools and unions. It is a real mess of an ossified bureaucracy that just isn't willing to change, even when there's better opportunities to help our children and improve our system. It's disconnected from the real world of work. Our students graduate and need to go on to finishing school, and the finishing school is going to be that first job that teaches students how to work and how to apply the knowledge that they've been acquiring in schools. And most starkly, the cultural and societal values and mores that are taught in schools are vastly different than that of the families. So what kids hear in their school desks is nothing like what they're hearing around the dinner table with their family. In fact, in many cases, quite the opposite. Another feature of the American system, which is not unique to us, but again, we do it bigger and better than everybody else, is immigration. Our nation is the leading receiver of refugees and taking in over 1 million legal immigrants a year. We by far lead the world in that respect. That's 47 million people. That's legal and recognized, but that could be half again as large, could be 60 million if you take into account the illegal people who are here undocumented illegally. But the interesting point, and the reason I bring them up, is if they're foreign born and they're in their late teens and coming here for jobs, well, they got their K through 12 education in another school. Maybe it was K through 6, most likely. And they came from an impoverished nation and don't have an education, which would pull the American number down. At the same time, we are a mecca for PhDs from the UK and Germany and people with master's degrees and executives from Japan and Taiwan and Hong Kong and India. So we also bring in a lot of educated folks. But the point is, there's 47 million people who were not educated in the US who are being counted in our number. So that needs to be taken into account. And then finally, let's talk about Singapore. An interesting micro community, again, of 5.7 million people. An island city state nation. It's a highly developed economy. Cost of living there is pretty darn expensive. It's Tokyo, Switzerland level cost of living. They, of course, again, number one in math, number one in science, number one in reading, and the PISA score. Their literacy rate at virtually 100%. Their spending per pupil just over $10,000. Seems to kind of be a threshold globally, in the developed world at least. And they also have their own bootstrap mentality story. But in their case, independence from Britain. In the early 60s, they became independent, not only from Britain, but broke off from Malaysia as well. And that was really quite traumatic. And they realized, according to their first enigmatic leader who ran the country like a corporation, we don't have land, we don't have resources, our location is pretty good, but all we really have is people. And so they invested very heavily in their people. The pillars of the Singapore system, first and foremost, is very high government spending in the area of education. Not too long ago, 1/4 of every dollar spent by the Singaporean government was in teaching teachers to teach, providing facilities for students, education in many various areas. The commitment today, I think this is a 2020 figure, 2019 figure, about 16% of government budget is spent on education. Now, just to bear that in mind, it's not that they're spending less, they're spending more, but all the other spending of the Singaporean government has grown much more dramatically than others. So there you have it. But spending is no doubt among the leading in the world in terms of percent of GDP. Their Thinking Schools Learning Nation is a program that was brought about in the mid to late 80s, where Singaporeans should treat education as a lifelong process. Most Singaporeans will, until late in their careers, and maybe never stop with continuing education. It's just endemic and part of their culture now. SOTA, was School of the Arts, was introduced to address a specific problem. Singapore, again, 30, 40 years ago, was producing almost robotic STEM subject focused students that really were one-dimensional and weren't well-rounded. And so they infused the education requirements with arts in addition to the academics. And that's produced some really great results for them as well. We're going to talk a little more about this later, but AQ, the critical thinking and real world problem solving, that's applied to both the teaching methodology and the examinations and the homework and curriculum, where you really need to emphasize applying the knowledge you learn in order to succeed. There's also a good citizenship, a social and moral component to what's taught in Singapore and how teaching is approached. And it creates very positive attitudes towards education and infusing things like thinking school, learning nations, where the expectation isn't, school's out and it's out of sight, out of mind, but learning is a lifelong endeavor. And this is something that I think that pays great social dividends as well. Singapore's also dropped very bad practices. There was a student rating system that, believe it or not, started at age 10. You had 10-year-olds sitting for national exams. And based on that one exam, when you were 10, You got into an EM school track or an EM1, EM2 school track or an EM3 school track. So what that meant is if you did really well on the exams, you got to go to the smart kids school. If you did okay, average with the 10-year-old exam, you went to average schools. And if you didn't do well, you went to the dummy school. And that was your life was tracked based on an exam that you took at age 10. So that was thrown out. That was just not conducive to a well-rounded first world educational system. And that's long gone. So they've been willing to get rid of bad practices and adopt new and good practices, which is something our system could certainly learn from. And then, of course, like Taiwan, parents are deeply engaged with their students studying, learning, education, and they do take universal extra classes. There's not an enrichment center on every street corner in Singapore. There's 3 enrichment centers on every street corner in Singapore. Every kid in Singapore, or 96%, have taken some kind of after-school education program, like a Kumon or something of that sort. So how do we access this education globally? It's out there, it's around the world. How does an American student or family or co-op or private school acquire this great resource now that it's available through remote technology? Well, let's take the case of Singapore Academy USA. If you look at the chart on the right, this really summarizes the 3 legs to the success stool, so to speak, of the Singapore formula. First, it is the parental engagement on the far right. The Singapore mom, as it was described to me, is the essential player here because she is, or dad, is driving the child towards and creating the proper attitudes for a lifelong approach to education. Fabulous teachers, well-trained, well-educated themselves, and very capable in terms of teaching the latest innovations and adaptations of the Singapore public school system, which relies on Singapore curriculum, which is quite innovative. And this has produced, obviously, their number 1 results in STEM, certainly in the English-speaking world, and the non-English speaking as well. They succeed where others fail, and their curriculum and teaching methodologies are transferable. They can be acquired anywhere where you have an internet hookup. The Singapore AQ approach. So I mentioned this earlier. So the adaptability or applicability quotient, they're almost virtually interchangeable, is really about developing your ability to apply the knowledge that you've learned. So, for example, you get applause because you learned the algebraic formula. You get bigger applause because you got it right on a test. But do you know how to use it? Do you know how to apply that knowledge? And so about 25% of classwork is applied to practical problem solving, household finance, business management problems, engineering. This is all part of the learning process. And when you've applied that knowledge, you develop a true understanding of what is being taught. And the results, great test scores. So when we deliver this education from Singapore teachers live to American students here in the US, we do that through remote technology. And it's got to be live to be interactive. Sitting in front of playing CDs and recorded classes just aren't the same. You really need that level of interactive level of exchange to make a lesson stick. We're also plug and play. We're turnkey. We provide complete courses, curriculum, live instruction, examinations, follow-up. So let's say a co-op or a private school would not need to hire any new teachers or a new administration. We're simply plug us in and play. We directly link to your students and add classes without adding overhead. We're flexible. You can select from any menu of our finished courses in science or mathematics. Or you can custom design a course if you're looking for certain goals. If you want to focus on biology and have specific objectives for marine biology, we can prepare a class custom built for you. We're modular. We have semester-long courses, and each of those semesters is broken into 4 different course packages, totaling 30 hours of live instruction, 2 hours a week. we're widely applicable. We could be a standalone program for you, or we can be a booster course supporting your existing programs. We're synchronized to school calendars. It's a 15-week calendar. Again, two hours a week, total of 30 hours of instruction after school, August to December. And we follow the school calendars and holidays here in Texas. And same for January through May. So we are a nice add-on that just flows right into the student's current school day, which are held either, say, an hour before or an hour after regular school classes. We can be mornings on the weekends, 8 to 9 a.m., or weekdays, 7 to 8 a.m., or in the evenings, 6 to 7 p.m. All of these are up to you. We will accommodate your needs. And we have small classes. We believe that our system works best with an ideal number of students of 12. 15 is max, is possible without losing performance. But once you get over 15 students, to have an interactive class where students are also writing on the board, the virtual board, and speaking back and forth to the teacher and each other, you really can't go over 15 students. Otherwise, it's chaos. And the language of instruction is, of course, English. And our Singapore teachers know the American accent all too well, and they accommodate us accordingly. So children won't have a difficult time understanding their teachers. So what's next? But when the world is wide open to us, why not Hogwarts, right? Okay, maybe not Hogwarts, but why not English classes from the UK? I've had requests already from customers who say, well, you're doing STEM from Singapore. When can I get an English course from England? Or maybe a world history course or another humanities course from England, Shakespearean literature, that sort of thing. All of that can be made available to students. They're 6 hours ahead in the UK. That's a class that could be taught morning or night. Whether we get to magic potions or not someday is certainly possible, but who knows? You never know. If it's remote, why not? But seriously, what could, with all these opportunities, with all these changes going on, with all this connectivity happening around the world, what could American K through 12 look like in 10 years? Well, I'm an optimist. I think that we're going to see this current breakup and shifting of students, this tidal wave of students leaving the poor schools and beating a path to better schools and better opportunities, be they private school or homeschool, is unstoppable. And the public school system is doing everything they can to help this process with their behavior and attitude towards the parents whose children they are entrusted with and whose taxes they're spending. I see increased competition, just like in the UK. I think the three bucket choice of public, private, or homeschool is going to expand. It's going to meld. So many different options are going to come into play eventually as this system breaks up and the private sector steps in to get a big piece or even a small piece of a very big pie that will provide parents with choice. What type of education do I want? Do I want it to be a testing-oriented, high-performance education? Do I want something that's more holistic, Christian education, or what have you? We can go in any direction as a society if we give people a choice and let the market decide. That would inevitably bring a decentralization to our education system, going back away from the centralized authority approach that we've seen in the last couple of decades, and give families and people more autonomy, more choice. It's quite interesting if you think about the one part of our economy. When you wanted to go shopping, you thought, okay, I get my shoes on, I get my coat on, get in my car, I drive to the store, I use my credit card or paying cash, or stop by the ATM to get cash, to buy the product, to come home. That's the way we used to buy things. Okay. Now I go on to my computer, I order something from Amazon, half a day later, next morning, it's sitting on my front porch. Why can't we have that in education? We should expect that in education. We're still doing things the way we did at the beginning of the 20th century, right? Nothing's fundamentally changed, but the world has dramatically changed. So education needs to change as well. And I foresee and I know you're going to be surprised at this, a delivery cost reduction. I actually think delivering K through 12 education to American students is going to get cheaper. And the reason is consolidation and the elimination of redundancy. Imagine options where you can have a hybrid system of education where your kids are at home 2 days a week, and the next day, 3 days, they go to one of a couple of schools in your area for their science labs, for the sports or music or other labs and facilities. The options are unlimited as to what we can do if we look around and we say, well, gee, we've got thousands of schools. Each one has a principal. Each one has assistant principal, a swimming coach, a pool, tennis courts, labs that sit empty and idle 90% of the time. And then 5 miles down the streets, another school exactly like that. Think of the redundancy there. And if we were to say, well, let's start turning some of this into real estate and really making sure that on Tuesdays and Thursdays, this co-op of homeschool students uses the labs, and on Mondays and Wednesdays, this school does. And we could literally, as if we approach this as a business, weed out tremendous billions of dollars of redundancy and waste in our current education system if we just let the private sector come in and impress us, to do what Amazon did for shopping, to make education completely flexible and choosable by the American public. And here's one of the things that I think is really beginning to hold things, or has been holding things back, but is beginning to disintegrate before our very eyes. Every year, last year, $760 billion, that's $760 billion was spent on K through 12 education in the United States. When I saw that the federal government chips in only about 8% of that, $59 billion, I was shocked. The way the federal government struts around our education system in K through 12, you think they were running the show. Well, you don't run the show for 8% because the remaining 92% is split about evenly between state funds and local funds. So my thinking is, well, the federal government is such a small bit player in all this. We need to make sure that we return power to the state and the local sources of these funds, which ultimately go to the choices of the parents. And so we're certainly capable of weeding a lot of money, wasted money out of this system, at the same time building tremendous efficiencies and giving the power back to parents. And what needs to happen in that case is you need portability. There are bills before 30 state houses right now that are proposed to give parents the choice of where their tax dollars go. That is, if you pay $6,000, $7,000 in property taxes and so much in sales taxes that go to schools, you will be able to choose where your child goes with that. Be it the local public school, be it a private school, be it homeschool, it's up to you to spend your money and where to go, much like the UK model. So now what? What happens to schools that are underperforming, that are distracted with CRT and other things that parents don't want their children to learn? Well, the parents can finally say, oh, sayonara, we're gone, and let their feet vote on whether or not they want their children to learn things that don't meet their social values and so forth. So I think we're at a key point, transition point, and the biggest nut to crack here, a finger in the dike, is this ensconced bureaucracy and collusion between the federal government and the public school system, which is daunting. It's a lot of money, folks. But if we can just pull that finger out and break this dam open, we can enjoy, I think, in 10 years, a very different education system for our next generation. So I would propose as a national goal to hand parents back the power of choice, to bring competition into the primary K through 12 education world. And like we did in the 60s with the space program, I think we should be in the top 10 in 10 years. I'm not saying number one, as I mentioned earlier, because we have a steady immigration, so that may not ever happen, but let's get in the top 10. Why shouldn't American students be sixth in reading, or 10th in math, or 8th in science, or even higher, number two, or even one in one of the categories? All of this is attainable if we set our mind to it. If we set it as a national goal, it's all doable. And it's all up to us, because parents now have woken up. They're in the school board meetings. They're seeing what's going on. They're running into that bureaucracy, and eventually, I think the siege that that parents are laying on the bureaucratic castle here will eventually produce results. We need to get the power back in the hands of parents, and we can certainly get ourselves back into the top 10 where we enjoyed once before. And much like the Apollo program itself, for every dollar spent on the moonshot, there were $10 of benefit to the economy, and new factories and new technologies and new materials that were developed. The styrofoam cup is always one classic example, but water disbursement 40, the 40th formula for dispersing water on rocket seals, WD-40. I mean, it was just an amazing dynamo generator of innovation and technological advancement in the U.S. Imagine what American students being in the top 10 in the world in education could do for our economy. It would be fabulous. So I am an optimist. I think things are going to get better before they get better. And I really appreciate your time today. If you, I love to talk about STEM. If you want to talk to me about your STEM ambitions and how we can help your students, please give me a call. I'm available anytime. And I want to thank you very much for your time today. And I welcome, again, any comments or suggestions, just reach out when you can. Thank you very much.